and put it into a box and try and present a perfect truth. You know, and there's no real way of doing that. And you always defame the person by trying. I've tried and failed. And this, I think, by kind of dissecting him and splitting him up.
Heath Ledger was never the kind of actor Hollywood could control. He chose challenging roles, avoided easy fame, and built a career on instinct and creative integrity. That commitment made his performances unforgettable, but it didn't always make things easy on set. Behind the scenes, some collaborations carried real tension that the public rarely saw. Not every working relationship was smooth. Here are 6 actors who reportedly had serious issues working with him. Let's get into it. Starting off with number 6, we turn to one of the most formative and most revealing professional dynamics of Ledger's early career, his reported working relationship with Mel Gibson during the production of Roland Emmerich's The Patriot in 2000. This film represented a significant professional moment for Ledger in the most concrete terms, his first major Hollywood production of genuine scale and commercial ambition, a studio historical epic that offered him the opportunity to demonstrate, alongside one of the era's most commercially dominant stars, that his abilities translated to the largest available canvas. Gibson was, at the time of the production, at the peak of a particular kind of Hollywood power, an actor-producer whose creative authority over any project he attached himself to was total and well-established, whose instincts about the commercial requirements of mainstream cinema were finely calibrated, and whose presence on a set generated a gravitational field that shaped every relationship within it. Ledger arrived on The Patriot set as Gabriel Martin, Gibson's eldest son, a role whose dramatic function required him to hold his own as a performer opposite one of the most forceful screen presences of the era, while simultaneously navigating the experience of working within a major Hollywood production for the first time at that level of scale. The reported tension between the two men was rooted in a contrast that people close to the production described as both immediate and persistent. Gibson's creative authority over the film was comprehensive in ways that extended beyond the conventional stature of a leading man. His vision for how the story should be told, how the characters should be positioned relative to each other, and how the emotional architecture of the father-son relationship should function on screen was one that he communicated with a directness that left limited space for a younger performer's instincts to operate independently. Ledger, whose creative independence was already a defining feature of his personality, reportedly found the experience of working within a professional environment so completely organized around another performer's creative authority genuinely difficult to navigate with the creative freedom he valued. His instinct was always toward the discovery of a character through his own internal process rather than through the accommodation of an externally imposed vision, and the particular dynamic of a production organized around Gibson's dominant creative personality created a working atmosphere that constrained that process in ways that people connected to the film described as a consistent source of friction. The generational gap between the two men, Gibson, the established Hollywood titan, Ledger, the 20-year-old newcomer navigating his first major studio production, was itself a structural feature of the dynamic that amplified the creative tension with a social dimension that was difficult to separate from it. Gibson's well-documented history of forceful creative engagement on the sets he dominated was not a new variable for the people who worked with him regularly, but for Ledger, encountering that dynamic for the first time in the specific context of a role that required him to perform a filial deference that was not entirely divorced from the real power differential between them, the experience created a working reality that was more demanding and more personally complicated than the film's straightforward historical adventure premise suggested. Neither man was inclined to the kind of open confrontation that would have made the tension dramatically visible to everyone on set, but the people who observed their working dynamic closely noted a quality of creative friction that persisted across the production in ways that shaped both men's experiences of making the film in ways they did not fully discuss publicly. What the experience gave Ledger was a clarifying early lesson about the specific cost of subordinating creative independence to the gravitational authority of a more powerful star, a lesson he spent the remainder of his career applying with increasing deliberateness. At number 5, we arrive at a dynamic that unfolded on one of the more energetic and commercially successful productions of Ledger's early career, the reported creative friction between him and Rufus Sewell during the filming of Brian Helgeland's A Knight's Tale in 2001. Sewell was cast as Count Adhemar, the imperious and elegantly menacing antagonist whose rivalry with Ledger's William Thatcher provides the film's central competitive spine. The role required Sewell to occupy a specific creative position, the villain of polished aristocratic contempt whose every scene with Ledger needed to generate a credible dynamic of threat and opposition. Sewell was a performer of genuine theatrical ability and considerable screen intelligence, whose capacity for a certain quality of dark, magnetic authority had been demonstrated across a range of significant productions before A Knight's Tale, and who brought to Adhemar a creative investment that was serious and fully realized.
The reported tension between Sewell and Ledger was described by people who worked on the production as rooted in the specific challenge that arises when two performers of strong and differently calibrated creative energies are required to sustain a dynamic of direct antagonism across the full length of a production. Ledger's approach to William Thatcher was characteristically spontaneous and physically inventive. He inhabited the character's essential quality of irrepressible, forward-leaning vitality with an ease and a naturality that reflected genuine creative alignment between performer and role. Sewell's process for inhabiting Adhemar was more more controlled and more architecturally deliberate, built on a careful construction of the character's physical and psychological distinctiveness that required a different quality of working environment than Ledger's more fluid and instinctive presence on set naturally provided. The calibration of their dynamic on the set of A Knight's Tale was something that Helgeland and his team managed with sustained attention throughout the shoot. The particular challenge was finding a working rhythm between two performers whose individual creative processes were producing excellent results in isolation, but whose specific methods did not naturally accommodate each other within the shared space of their scenes. People connected to the production noted that the working atmosphere during the sequences featuring both men required more active directorial mediation than the film's broadly comedic and energetic tone might have suggested, and that the competitive dynamic between their characters had a real-world parallel that was less comfortable and less playful than the film's spirit would have led observers to expect. Both men delivered performances that served the film's requirements effectively, and A Knight's Tale's central rivalry remains one of its most entertaining elements. But the process of achieving that result was one that people on the production consistently described as more fraught than the finished film's breezy confidence revealed. Coming down to number 4, we arrive at one of the most widely discussed and most humanly complex dynamics of Ledger's career, the working relationship between him and Jake Gyllenhaal during the filming of Ang Lee's Brokeback Mountain in 2005. The cultural significance of this film, a love story between two cowboys whose relationship unfolds across decades of societal pressure, personal compromise, and irreversible loss, was understood by everyone involved in its production from the earliest stages of development.
Gyllenhaal, cast as Jack Twist, the more openly expressive and emotionally available of the two central figures, brought to the role a quality of genuine warmth and psychological openness that served the character's essential nature with real effectiveness. Ledger's Enes Del Mar required something of an entirely different and considerably more demanding creative order. A character whose emotional interior was accessible only through the smallest and most carefully controlled external signals, whose suppressed inner life was communicated through a quality of absolute physical containment that demanded sustained creative discipline of an intensity that went beyond anything the role's apparent reticence suggested on the surface. The reported tension between Gyllenhaal and Ledger was rooted in the specific challenge of calibrating two very different emotional registers within scenes that required a precise and delicate balance between expressiveness and containment. Gyllenhaal's more accessible and outwardly generous emotional process created a working dynamic that was, by accounts from people connected to the production, not always naturally aligned with the particular quality of internal intensity that Ledger's approach to Enes required. Sustaining the emotional reality of their characters' connection while navigating the creative friction of two fundamentally different psychological approaches to that connection was a challenge that Lee managed throughout the shoot with the extraordinary sensitivity and patience that characterized his directorial approach to the material. People who worked on Brokeback Mountain described the working dynamic between the two men as one that required more active emotional management than the film's ultimately devastating intimacy suggested, a behind-the-scenes reality whose difficulty was entirely invisible in the finished performances, both of which stand as among the most genuinely affecting of either career. The tension did not compromise the work, but it shaped the experience of producing it in ways that both men carried through the long months of the shoot and beyond. At number 3, we turn to one of the most documented and most extensively analyzed creative dynamics of Ledger's final completed performance, his working relationship with Christian Bale during the production of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight in 2007 and 2008. Bale occupied the center of the Dark Knight production in a way that was both formally and creatively absolute. His Bruce Wayne and Batman were the franchise's structural foundation, the character around whom the entire narrative architecture of Nolan's reimagining had been constructed. His approach to the role was the product of years of careful development, a fully realized internal logic that had been built across Batman Begins and refined into something more psychologically complex and more physically detailed than anything the franchise had previously offered.
Ledger's preparation for the Joker was, by the accounts of everyone who observed it or encountered its results, one of the most total and most deliberately isolating processes of creative immersion that contemporary Hollywood had witnessed. He had spent weeks alone constructing the Joker's psychology and physicality and voice and behavioral logic from a foundation of specific and carefully chosen influences, developing a character whose essential quality of anarchic, philosophically coherent chaos could only be sustained through a degree of creative separation from the ordinary social rhythms of professional life on a film set that made him, for the duration of the production, genuinely difficult to interact with in any conventional sense. The reported tension between Ledger and Bale was not rooted in personal animosity. Both men were deeply serious about their work, and both brought complete creative commitment to a production whose ambitions were evident to everyone involved. The friction was more structural than personal, arising from the specific challenge of two performers, each sustaining a completely realized and internally consistent creative world that did not naturally share space with the others. Bale's Batman operated from a place of psychologically grounded, controlled intensity that had been developed with meticulous architectural precision. Ledger's Joker was something categorically different, a creative presence of such radical unpredictability and such complete psychological otherness that working opposite it in any conventional rehearsed sense was not really possible, and that required Bale to operate in a mode of constant real-time adaptation that was, by accounts from people on the production, genuinely demanding in ways that went beyond the ordinary challenges of filming opposite a strong performer. Nolan has spoken with genuine care about the working dynamic on The Dark Knight, describing a set whose creative atmosphere was shaped by the extraordinary nature of what Ledger was doing in ways that everyone present was aware of and responded to with a mix of professional admiration and genuine personal unease. The scenes between Batman and the Joker carry an electricity that reflects, in some real and documented measure, the specific quality of friction and genuine unpredictability that characterized their creation. Bale has been consistently generous in his public reflections on Ledger's performance, while allowing, in the texture of what he describes, a clear picture of working alongside something that was at once extraordinary and genuinely difficult to accommodate within the ordinary parameters of professional collaboration.
At number 2, we arrive at a tension that has been discussed with notable consistency in industry circles. The complicated dynamic that reportedly developed between Ledger and Orlando Bloom across the period of their careers when both men were navigating the extraordinary and in certain ways deeply uncomfortable experience of simultaneous meteoric rise within the same commercial Hollywood landscape. Bloom's ascent, driven by the Lord of the Rings and Pirates of the Caribbean franchises, had made him one of the most commercially visible young actors in the world at precisely the moment when Ledger's own profile was rising through a different but equally significant trajectory. The comparison between them, made constantly by the industry, by the press, and by the studio seeking to understand and manage both careers, created an interpersonal dynamic that was competitive in ways that neither man had chosen, but both were required to navigate. The reported tension between Ledger and Bloom was rooted in the specific and uncomfortable reality of two performers of similar age, similar commercial positioning, and significant personal differences in temperament and creative philosophy being consistently placed in comparison by an industry that assessed their value partly through the lens of their relationship to each other. Ledger's instinct was always to move away from commercial expectation, to choose projects that challenged rather than confirmed his existing audience, and to treat the studio system's assessment of his value with a degree of skeptical independence that was genuine and consistently expressed. Bloom's trajectory was more naturally aligned with the franchise infrastructure of mainstream Hollywood, and the contrast between their respective relationships to that infrastructure was something that created a creative and personal friction in the environments where their paths crossed. People who moved in the professional circles that both men inhabited during the height of their simultaneous prominence described a dynamic characterized by a competitive wariness that was, in Ledger's case, rooted in a genuine resistance to being defined by the comparison itself, to having his creative identity assessed in terms of a rivalry he had not sought and did not find creatively meaningful. The reported tension was not one of direct personal conflict, but of the more persistent and more difficult kind that arises when two people are placed in continuous comparison by an industry that neither of them can fully control, and when the terms of that comparison create a professional dynamic that is uncomfortable for both parties regardless of their individual goodwill. For Ledger specifically, the experience of being consistently positioned alongside Bloom within the industry's commercial hierarchy was a concrete expression of exactly the kind of reductive categorization that his creative choices were designed to resist, and the friction that generated in the professional spaces they shared was real enough to be noted consistently by people who observed it.
And now we arrive at number 1, the most complex, most personally revealing, and most profoundly resonant of all the difficult professional relationships in Heath Ledger's career. This is the story of his dynamic with Terry Gilliam during the production of The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, the film that Ledger was working on on at the time of his death in January 2008, and whose production circumstances carry a human weight that makes any honest account of the tension within it one of the most sobering and most affecting chapters in the history of modern cinema. To fully understand the working dynamic between Ledger and Gilliam, it is necessary to first appreciate what Gilliam represented as a director and what the Parnassus Project meant to Ledger at the specific moment in his career when he agreed to take it on. Gilliam was one of cinema's most singular and most demanding creative personalities, a visionary director whose productions were legendary within the industry for the extraordinary ambition of their creative vision and the extraordinary difficulty of their physical and logistical realization. His history of troubled productions, from Brazil through The Adventures of Baron Munchausen to the famously unfinished The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, had established him as someone whose creative genius was inseparable from a quality of professional volatility that made his sets among the most demanding working environments in the international film industry. Ledger came to Parnassus in a specific and significant personal context. He had recently completed his work on The Dark Knight, had separated from his partner Michelle Williams, and was navigating a period of significant personal difficulty that those close to him described as one of the more turbulent stretches of his adult life. The Parnassus Project represented, in certain respects, a deliberate creative retreat into something more intimate and more imaginatively free than the scale of the production he had just completed. A film whose fantastical premise and Gilliam's characteristically anarchist directorial vision offered a quality of creative liberation that Ledger found genuinely appealing at that moment in his personal and professional life. And
the reported tensions between Ledger and Gilliam during the early stages of the Parnassus production were rooted in the specific challenge of two creative personalities of genuine and strongly individual conviction finding their working equilibrium within a production whose imaginative ambitions were considerable and whose practical conditions were, even by the standards of a Gilliam production, genuinely demanding. Gilliam's directorial process required from his performers a quality of creative surrender to the chaos of his vision that was simultaneously liberating and profoundly disorienting, a willingness to inhabit a creative world that was entirely the director's and to function within its logic without the support of the kind of carefully managed working environment that more conventional productions provided. Ledger's own creative process, which required a specific and carefully cultivated internal space for the development of a character, was not naturally compatible with the organized unpredictability that Gilliam's method inevitably generated. People connected to the early stages of the Parnassus production described a working dynamic between the two men that was characterized by a real and persistent negotiation over the creative terms of their collaboration, over how much space Ledger's process would be allowed within Gilliam's vision, and over how much of Gilliam's improvisational creative authority Ledger's approach could accommodate without compromising the internal integrity he brought to every character he inhabited. The friction was genuine, and it was noted by the people managing the production's daily reality in ways that made it clear it was a feature of the working environment that required sustained attention. What makes this dynamic the most significant and the most permanently affecting in Ledger's professional story is the context that renders any ordinary account of it inadequate. The fact that the tension between the two men was interrupted, unresolved, and permanently incomplete by Ledger's death on the 22nd of January 2008. The production he had been working on, the creative friction he had been navigating with Gilliam, the character whose development had been in progress, all of it was cut off with an abruptness that transformed the story of a difficult professional relationship into something of an entirely different order of human meaning.
Gilliam's response to Ledger's death and his remarkable and deeply moving decision to continue the film with Johnny Depp, Jude Law, and Colin Farrell each taking on the Tony character in the film's fantastical sequences, transforming the production's incompleteness into a tribute of genuine and lasting beauty, speaks to a creative and personal generosity that exists in complicated relationship with the reported tensions of the production's early stages. The finished film, released in 2009, carries Ledger's presence as something both extraordinary and heartbreaking, the evidence of a creative intelligence that was still in the process of becoming what it was always going to be, interrupted at a moment of genuine and irreplaceable artistic development. The tension between Ledger and Gilliam, real and unresolved, became in retrospect not the story of a difficult professional relationship, but one of the more quietly devastating examples of what is lost when a creative life is cut short before its most significant work is complete. But not every collaboration turned into conflict. Among the working relationships that Ledger navigated with genuine warmth and deep creative satisfaction, two stand out with particular and consistent prominence across the testimony of everyone who knew him well. His creative partnership with Ang Lee on Brokeback Mountain was, despite the tensions within the ensemble, something Ledger spoke about with genuine and sustained gratitude. A directorial relationship in which he found the specific quality of patient, psychologically intelligent support that his most demanding work required, and that gave him the confidence to reach for a performance that many considered the finest of his career. Lee's understanding of what Ledger was attempting with Ennis Del Mar was complete and generous in ways that Ledger found profoundly sustaining. His working relationship with the ensemble cast of A Knight's Tale, and specifically the genuine friendship and creative warmth he developed with director Brian Helgeland across that production, represented another model of professional connection that those close to Ledger consistently cited as one of the more joyful experiences of his career. A set where his natural humor and collaborative generosity found a working environment that fully accommodated them, and that produced in him a quality of creative ease that people who worked on the film described with real warmth. The professional life of Heath Ledger, considered with the honesty and the tenderness that his memory genuinely deserves, is the story of a young man whose gifts were of the rarest kind, and whose relationship to those gifts was one of total and uncompromising seriousness. The tensions explored here were not incidental to who he was. They were the product of the same fierce creative integrity that made his performances impossible to dismiss and impossible to forget. What he left behind in the work he completed before January 2008 is, by the consensus of everyone who has engaged with it seriously, more than enough to establish his place among the most genuinely extraordinary performers that the craft of acting has produced. And the work that was never made remains in its own way one of cinema's most irreplaceable losses.